Hi, and welcome to my paper, titled Book Ciphers and the Medieval Unreadable. The purpose of this talk is to reconsider the forms, purposes, and visual appearances of ciphers, and to situate them within the broader framework of early medieval culture by considering how meaning could be encoded in text. To do so, I want to start by discussing the function of the encoding process, which underpins all early medieval writing. Every form of abbreviation in Western Latin script is a form of encoding, and its use presupposes two important processes: learning the symbols as part of the study of grammar, which were divided into special categories, including common, critical, epistolary, legal, military, and shorthand signs, instead of forming a single monolithic block, and using these signs not only to understand texts, but also so as to be understood by others, an occasionally difficult task since not all scribes learned all signs, and confusion is known to have occurred. That early medieval people understood the function of abbreviations in encoding meaning is demonstrated by the example of a 9th century Liber Comitis, in which, as the manuscript description notes, there are almost no abbreviations, with the exceptions of nomina sacra and some other common words, particularly in formulaic phrases. This meant that the manuscript was well suited to ceremonial reading aloud, without stumbling over the decoding of a wider range of encoded words. An innovation of the early Middle Ages was the introduction of cryptographic codes to the study of grammar. This may be partly due to the influence of the 7th century grammarian Vigilius Maro, who introduced the doctrine of word scrambling or code breaking, scinderatio phonorum, changing verse or word order, or splitting a word across a sentence. Scinderatio phonorum was part of a process of making things difficult, which was used as a widespread technique of hermeneutic training that taught learners to justify every act of interpretation. Vigilius gave 3 reasons for using such a strategy of encoding: for building up the memory and intellect of students, for ornamenting speech and poetry, and as a sign of mystical truths that require interpretative acts to be uncovered. Encoding was, then, a useful way of training memory, literary agility, and advanced interpretation of scripture for Vigilius Maro in the 7th century. But it was also a natural development from statements made by Augustan and late antique authors such as Prudentius about the importance of grammar for the interpretation of Christian literature. This was in keeping with the Christian focus of post-Roman Latin learning, centered as it was in monasteries, and with the growing preference of silent individual reading over reading aloud, driven by the concept of lectio divina and its emphasis on memory. Isidore of Seville made the power of letters and words to encode meaning even more explicit. He said, "Letters are the tokens of things, the signs of words, and they have so much force that the utterances of those who are absent speak to us without a voice, for they present words through the eyes, not through the ears." The proliferation of alphabets, both real and invented, the creative visual treatment of letter initials, and the many varieties of word and letter-based puzzles in the early medieval West ultimately derived from the idea expressed here so clearly by Isidore. Although the kinds of cryptographic encoding we find in early medieval manuscripts are generally very basic, there can be no comparison, for example, between the professional mastery required for shorthand on the one hand and Caesar shift on the other. Nevertheless, they fulfilled 2 important purposes. The first was training both of memory and of hermeneutic skills essential for more complex decoding. One example of a text that might need such skills is the strange writing of Martianus Capella. By the time school learners accessed this text, they were not only required to disentangle its difficult passages, but also to engage their memory of the wider literary culture of their time. The Carolingian Capellian commentary tradition constantly brings in other authorities and leads the reader away from the text to a network of other texts. The nature of scholarship here is one of debate and discussion. Building on this idea, in this paper I would like to propose that there was also a second purpose to cryptographic encoding in early medieval books: the activation of intellectual networks and the corresponding expression of group identity. Mary Carruthers has shown how the various kinds of medieval evidence for the memory arts point to a largely unarticulated but widespread understanding of memory as something that was the basis of creative thought, a necessary tool for creating new knowledge, and a skill to be trained. It was not an element of rote learning, but a necessary active component of medieval communication. Early medieval cryptographic encoding had a similar role, embedded as it was in language learning, rhetoric, and literacy. It was therefore a tool of communication, but as the evidence will show, not for general use. As a product of intellectual training and tradition, coded information enables specific groups and communities to affirm their shared contexts. Ciphers can therefore be viewed as expressions of identity in ways that I'd like to discuss now. The earliest book ciphers in the Latin West appear to have originated in an insular context, and their early medieval continental usage generally points to insular influence. The most widespread ciphers are the Noti Bonifatii, said to have been invented by St. Boniface. Although there is no evidence that he did, he may well have popularized them. Two types of this cipher can be distinguished. Type 1, in which vowels are replaced with the number of dots that represents their position in the alphabet, which are then arranged roughly in the shape of the vowel, a system also known in early medieval Ireland. And type 2, a kind of Caesar shift, in which vowels are replaced with the following consonants, of which we'll discuss some examples shortly. On the continent, they are first mentioned in De Inventione Literarum, a text attributed to Rabanus Maurus but composed anonymously in Eastern Francia. Its oldest copy dates from the end of the 8th century. It originally contained information about various real and invented abecedaries, but later versions included additional material, including the Noti Bonifatii. This material was evidently current and subject to change. Often, the encoding of names using Noti Bonifatii indicated insular influence networks of patronage. The scribe of one late 10th or early 11th century copy of the Life of Saint Deicolus from Luxeuil included a colophon using type 2 Noti Bonifatii. This was written by Stephanus at the command of Master Archimbatus. The main text about the colophon is the Vita of Saint Deicolus or Diquil, a follower of Columbanus who also founded Luxeuil. By inserting his name in the colophon using a cipher with insular associations, the scribe may have been showing his awareness of the Irish origin of these centres and the place of himself and his teacher in this history. In the second quarter of the 9th century, the Fulda monk Risala may have encoded his name using type 2 Noti for similar reasons. Appearing in a long explicate at the end of a copy of Bede's Commentary of the Apocalypse, it reads, "Pray for the scribe who is called Risala." Just before this, Risala included a quote from Virgil's Georgics. "But we in our course have traversed a mighty plain, and now it is time to release the steaming necks of the horses." In the juxtaposition of this highly literary quotation signifying the end of a long labour, which also references traditional scribal colophons lamenting their back-breaking work, and a cipher, we may see a clear connection between intellectual networks and early medieval cryptography within an insular context. The intellectual expectations embedded in these codes were not restricted to male use. In an early 9th century copy of the Vita Willibaldi, made in the Diocese of Eichstätt, abbreviated ordinal numbers are used to encode vowels in the phrase revealing the text's author. I, a Saxon nun named Hugeburg, wrote this. Hugeburg may have been operating within the cryptographic tradition established by the Circle of St. Boniface in and around the Mainz River Valley, but more importantly, the modesty she expressed in her writing, juxtaposed with the cleverness of her cipher, was a rhetorical device that would have been understood and appreciated by the intellectuals that were her contemporaries. It was in itself a cultural code that established her as a serious writer among her peers. The flexibility of ciphers and the attraction of puzzles did also mean that coded names could simply express monastic humility or playfulness or represent practice stints. This is almost certainly the case with a marginal note copied by an inexpert hand in a 9th century manuscript of poetry, probably used in an early medieval classroom, written in type 1 notae Bonifatii, here also arranged roughly in the shape of the vowel itself, which reads Bernardus puer me fecit, Bernard a boy made me. Another colophon in a late 9th or 10th century copy of liturgical and ecclesiastical texts from southern Germany, written in type 2 notae Bonifatii, is perhaps also ciphered only to attract attention. It reads, Amen, here ends the book. As sweet as the port is to those sailing, so is the last verse to scribes. Those reading what is written in this book pray for him, the unworthy cleric Regin Poldus, so that he who offers this to you may go deserving to Christ, because he laboured on this book. It seems odd to say that a cipher could be used to draw attention rather than conceal, but these codes are very obvious on the manuscript page and irresistible to decode. They helped to ensure that readers would pray for the scribe. Even when ciphers are obviously used to encode a difficult or taboo subject, they do not do so to hide them, but rather to add an additional layer of meaning, a warning that this is a sensitive topic, or perhaps an indication that this is a subject on which more information should be sought. For example, the Old High German gloss drutbidi, or vomit, is coded using type 1 notae Bonifatii in the margin of the penitential of Pseudo Egbert, which discusses a penalty for throwing up the Eucharist. And the same cipher encodes the marginal note interfector matris, or matricide, next to a discussion of Marcus Publicius Malleolus's murder of his mother, in a much-studied copy of Orosius's Histories. It is clear that when words or names were written using notae Bonifatii, and we should not forget that this is a very small minority, of course, of all medieval words or colophons, they generally invoked complex networks of intellectual sponsorship or added further levels of information. In addition to notae Bonifatii, the other common early medieval cipher was based on alphabets, both real and invented. They enabled writers to experiment with meaning and to train a hermeneutic approach. The variety and complexity of the alphabets available in the early Middle Ages meant that particular traditions of use were able to develop among certain groups of people. Probably the earliest such use was the invented alphabet used by Boniface and his circle to encode the names of letter recipients. In a copy of their correspondence, written by a single scribe in Mainz during the second half of the 9th century, there appear several instances of this code, showing both continental and insular names of both men and women. On folio 4 recto, the name of an abbess Kuniburg is ciphered using the invented alphabet, while the names of the authors of the letter, Denehard, Lull, and Burchard, are heavily abbreviated. The use of these ciphers helped to create a network whose participants felt that they belonged to the same privileged group. In the case of some other groups, unique alphabets were used more unconsciously as part of a tradition which happened to develop. The effect may have been much the same, however. At Freising, a runic cipher was introduced, perhaps by the 8th century monk Peregrinus. The runes were used regularly at Freising in the same erroneous way, to the point that they were on the cusp of becoming a local tradition. This was almost certainly known as a distinguishing characteristic of Freising learning in the early Middle Ages. A cipher as an embodiment of a local tradition was also used in southern Bavaria, where a set of neumes came to be used in place of a Latin alphabet. Other examples are also known from centres across the southern German-speaking areas, including Tegernsee and St. Gall. Were such in-house cryptographic alphabets perhaps markers of communal monastic identity? This may have been made possible by the use of such alphabets for monastic memory training and the varying availability of the necessary lists in different centres. A particularly strong enthusiasm for exotic alphabets seems to have been associated with computistical manuscripts, especially but not exclusively Fleury. This may have been due to Bede's influence. In the first chapter of De Temporum Ratione, the standard early medieval computistical textbook, he showed how the different positions of the hands used in finger reckoning or loquela digitorum can also be used as a secret sign language. When you wish to show the first letter of the alphabet, hold up 1 with your hand, for the second 2, for the third 3, and so on in that order. For example, if you wish to warn a friend who is among traitors to act cautiously, show with your fingers 3, 1, 20, 19, 5, and 1, 7, 5. In this order, the letters signify caute age, act cautiously. In view of the complexity of early medieval intellectual training, Bede's inclusion of a cipher was almost certainly intended as a serious aid rather than light-hearted relief from computistical tedium. As he pointed out, anyone who knew how to sign numbers could also sign words. Doing this taught learners to make the signs for different numbers in a variety of orders instead of simply smallest to greatest, keeping them in the mind's eye as they would need to do with mental arithmetic. They also learned that, like different words, different principles could require and inform computistical calculation. They developed lateral thinking, mental flexibility, and mathematical ability. Crucially, this was a practical exercise which taught students to do without thinking time and writing materials. Computistical information needed to reside in the memory. Seen from this perspective, Bede's description of Greek alphanumeric characters as a computus Graecorum and the inclusion of similar cryptographic material in computistical manuscripts is entirely unsurprising. It was an essential component of learning computus. The third and final principle of early medieval cryptographic encoding is the appearance of the code on the page. The foundations of this have already been described by Ildar Garibzanov in his extensive study of graphicacy, or visual literacy. The visuality of ciphers is a key component of their function, which was often tied in with both intellectual authority and self-identification. In Ottfried of Weissenburg's Evangelienbuch, an Old High German poem about the life of Christ, the names of the author as well as those of his patrons Louis the German and Solomon I, Bishop of Constance, and his friends Hartmut and Werinbert, monks at St. Gall, are embedded within their dedicatory sections. Ottfried evidently expected these men to understand and appreciate the encoding of their names in this way, which echoes the visual representation of authority in contemporary monograms and liturgical books. Solomon was Ottfried's teacher while they were both based in Fulda, which retained strong insular links beyond the 9th century, and it is possible that Hartmut and Werinbert were also trained there or in another insular influence center. As well as activating networks of patronage and insular identity, visual ciphers were also used for Christian study, both devotional and intellectual. The figural poems of Rabanus Maurus are an excellent example of this. Rabanus Maurus was indebted to Optatian, as he stated in the preface to In Honorum Sanctae Crucis, but he consciously took a cycle of poems celebrating imperial Rome and repurposed them for celebrating the glory of God. The spectacular complexity of the Chiro monogram in Carmen 22 is only one example of this. The act of reading the poems becomes an act of devotion, not only by tracing the figures with your finger as you read, but also through the complex numerological, symbolic, and allegorical meanings of the figures, as explained in detail by Rabanus. The rarefied context of acrostic and figural poems was rooted in a wider visual language. One 8th century Gregorian sacramentary from Saint Amand contains highly developed monogrammatic forms, including the phrase vere dignus and others, which Garibzanov has shown to have been visual attributes of both divine and secular authority. At the same time, the contemporary notes and doodles in inexpert hands throughout this manuscript demonstrate that books with such signs were not restricted to services, but were accessible to learners, who absorbed their visual language and became experts in its encoded forms. According to Mary Carruthers, there is a clear persistent theme in all medieval mnemonic advice, to take advantage of the presentation of the physical page as a fixative for memory. The implication of this for early medieval cryptography is that it provided a means to introduce personal, perhaps even political, messages within the complex structure of the page, whose meaning all literate elite could understand. In the case of early medieval cryptography, paradoxically, we cannot speak of something secret or unreadable. It is much more useful to ask, for whom was this readable, and in what ways? Thank you very much for your time and attention.